Okay, everyone, welcome back to the final panel of Cultures of Energy 9. It's been, for those of you who've been with us for the past couple of days, it's been an amazing event, and this panel promises to be a wonderful capstone. My name is Dominic Boyer. I'm the former director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences here at Rice. I want to acknowledge that Houston's located on the unceded lands of the indigenous peoples known as the Sana, the Arakapa Ishak, the Coyotecatl, the Karankawa, and the Akokisa. And our panel today is focusing, final panel today is focusing on energy justice, which is a topic of great personal interest of mine. Some of you may know the work I've done with Simony Howe on the politics of wind power in southern Mexico. And one of the great lessons of that research was that it's possible to do a renewable energy transition in a way that you may change where the source of your electricity comes from, but leaves a lot of colonial and indeed extractivist legacies in place. So this panel, which focuses on questions of energy justice, is an attempt to open up this conversation, which I think is absolutely central to the energy humanities where we are now, and especially where we need to go in the future. So I want to welcome four wonderful panelists to this conversation today. And I'm going to read their short bios now in the order in which they'll present. They're each going to present for about 15 minutes based on their research, and then we're going to have a chance to go to Q&A. So please, if you have questions as you go along, don't hesitate to put them into the Q&A feature on your Zoom, and we'll gather those as we go. And then right around the hour mark at 5, we're going to transition, 5 Houston time, we'll transition to open discussion. So without further ado, let me start off with Myles Lennon, who is an environmental anthropologist, the Dean's Assistant Professor of Environment and Society and Anthropology at Brown University, and a former sustainable energy policy practitioner himself. His research focuses on solar energy infrastructure and race and class and Black land stewardship in the United States. Myles will be our first speaker. Our second speaker will be Alana West, who is a PhD candidate with the University of Technology Sydney Climate Justice Research Center. Special thanks to Alana for joining us very early in the morning, her time. So happy to have you here. She's active in climate and social justice movement. She strives to produce knowledge and ideas useful to social movements and social change. Her PhD is a comparative feminist ethnographic study of renewable energy transitions in rural Australia that draws on energy injustice, alienation, materialist ecofeminism, and the commons as her conceptual inspirations. Our third speaker will be Jéssica Malenayi Coyotecatl Contreras, who is a PhD student in the Anthropology department at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research deals with infrastructure projects as territorial and social transformations. Her dissertation attacks on social reproduction in the subterranean connectivity infrastructure in Mexico's sovereign energy transition. It concerns a collaborative project about oil infrastructure abandonment, as well as a second project, a collaborative project about oil infrastructure abandonment in Central California. So those two projects are the focus of our research right now. Her work builds on a feminist political economic perspective and anti-extractivism struggles. And our fourth speaker, Nikki Luke, is an assistant professor of geography at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. She's carried out research on energy justice and solidarity with workers and communities in the U.S. South, and is currently working on a book project about urban energy and labor politics in Atlanta, Georgia. Thanks to all of our speakers for being with us this late afternoon before a holiday weekend. Thanks to all of you for joining us on Zoom. And I think we're ready to move on to Myles. Myles, would you like to lead us off?
Great, sounds great. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. I have a lot to say, so I'm going to jump in it and first just acknowledge that I'm currently on the occupied homelands of the Narragansett people, otherwise known as Providence, Rhode Island. And of course, I want to just start by thanking the organizers for this fabulous conference and for having me. It's a real privilege. So today I'm going to talk about how we can better align energy justice efforts in low-income communities of color in the United States with broader efforts for environmental justice transnationally. And I'm going to do this by proposing a praxis for connecting communities of color on both the downstream and upstream stages of transnational solar technology supply chains. This praxis aims to better align community-based solar campaigns with the principles of environmental justice, or EJ for short. And so to begin, as many of us know, for the last decade, the United States EJ movement has called for a just energy transition that actively focuses on and is led by communities of color, communities disproportionately burdened by and vulnerable to fossil fuel climate change. Now, this work has often taken the form of local solar campaigns focused on ramping up solar in ways that enable communities of color to own and actually control the power that they depend on to live. These communities have several barriers to going solar, including, but not limited to, a dearth of disposable income, roofs in poor condition, a lack of capital improvement funds for rooftops, and the fact that many people in these communities rent and don't own their homes. So to address some of these barriers, community-based solar campaigns led by EJ organizations follow what is called the Solarize Model. And under the Solarize Model, a local organization engages in on-the-ground door knocking and community canvassing to form community-based solar purchasing pools. Such purchasing pools consist of local residents, businesses, community institutions such as houses of worship and schools, and all of them commit to installing solar with a single contractor who in turn commits to dramatically lowering costs for the community for a set period of time. And as part of this process, the community issues a request for proposals from contractors soliciting, pragmatic strategies to make solar very affordable by leveraging economies of scale. So the bigger the community purchasing pool, the more concessions that contractors are willing to make. And through these concessions, low-income communities have been able to afford solar, either taking direct ownership over the infrastructures on their roofs or entering into power purchase agreements that entitle them to outright ownership after a set period of time. EJ organizations often situate these sorts of solarized campaigns in a broader framework for change, such as this oft-cited graphic that contrasts the profit-oriented violence of what it calls the extractive economy with the sustainable communalism of what it calls the regenerative economy. But I want to suggest that this extractive regenerative dichotomy, the sense that community solar campaigns are fighting the status quo, overlooks the numerous environmental injustices that are part and parcel of solar supply chains. In other words, when we look beneath the shiny gloss of a solar array, we find it actually betrays this extractive regenerative dichotomy because it's precisely the extractive economy, mining, dumping, corporate commodities, transnational supply chains, and poor labor conditions in communities of color that make many, not all, but many solar panels possible. Solar is often made with toxic chemicals like silicon tetrachloride and cadmium, plastics made from fossil fuels, of course, deplorable labor conditions, primarily in China, where many indigent workers' communities are poisoned by the pollution from solar manufacturing plants, or right here in the United States, where federal prisoners manufacture panels for essentially no wages. And hell, for that matter, while we tout the carbon-reducing capacity of renewable energy, sulfur hexafluoride, the most potent greenhouse gas, has been used to clean the reactors in solar manufacturing plants, although there's some anecdotal evidence that suggests, thankfully, that this practice is a thing of the past. Solar panels also generate e-waste when they're decommissioned, and e-waste, as we all know, disproportionately burdens poor communities of color the world over. The point here is that as solar panels are deployed in communities of color in the global north to fight environmental injustices, if you follow the supply chain, you find that they're actually contributing to environmental injustices. Furthermore, because solarized campaigns are focused on reducing the cost of solar, on getting a good price, these campaigns don't take into consideration the labor conditions, environmental conditions, or supply chains of the corporations that they're procuring from. Whether a solar manufacturer abides by basic labor standards is not of relevance when a campaign is focused primarily on getting the best price. In a solarized campaign, product evaluation often occurs through spreadsheets with various metrics related largely to costs, a set of figures entirely divorced from the environmental and social conditions of the products that they point to. And while this concern for price is animated by a desire to reduce carbon emissions, I want to suggest that a narrow focus on the quantitative metrics of carbon and cost demonstrates how solar can take our attention away from the means of production by centering what I like to call the means of reduction. The means of production, of course, refers to raw materials, factories, financial investments, infrastructure, machinery, and other tools used to produce goods, services, and ultimately economic value. What I'm calling the means of reduction refers to the practices through which we represent a good or service as capable of quantitatively reducing a negative phenomenon, such as greenhouse gas emissions or electricity bills. And an example of such a representational practice would be a spreadsheet or a cost reduction graphic like this. And in focusing on the means of reduction instead of the means of production, EJ groups unwittingly reproduce the logics and practices of the extractive economy in spite of their best efforts to realize a regenerative economy. Specifically, in focusing on reducing prices, they prioritize contractors who use solar panels manufactured by companies with a poor record of worker rights, health, and safety, a poor record of reporting on their supply chains and their panels' toxicity, and a mediocre record of using energy and generating emissions in their operations. Therefore, I want to suggest that the US EJ movement must align community-based solar campaigns with transnational environmental justice principles by addressing their campaigns' solar supply chains. And toward this end, I want to propose a new community solar praxis committed to EJ at all points of the solar supply chain. This praxis consists of a conceptual framework focused on co-pollutants and 3 pragmatic practices for operationalizing this framework. So I'll now break this down, starting with the co-pollutant framework, a framework focused on recognition. Because if we want to ensure a just transition, we must first recognize that all forms of industrialized energy, including solar, have corrosive repercussions that disproportionately affect communities of color. And one way we can recognize such harms is through the EJ concept of co-pollutants. This concept calls attention to the ways in which energy generation and other industrial practices simultaneously generate greenhouse gases and pollutants, such as nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. In labeling such pollutants co-pollutants, EJ scholars highlight how the fossil-fueled infrastructures that significantly contribute to climate change also contribute to public health problems that disproportionately impact poor communities of color. But crucially, analyses of co-pollutants highlight the ways in which some strategies to reduce greenhouse gases only marginally reduce environmental hazards in marginalized communities, and inversely, the ways in which other strategies significantly address environmental injustices, because there's not an identical correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants across different industrial sectors, meaning that some efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions more effectively mitigate co-pollutants than others. As such, an EJ approach to climate mitigation explicitly prioritizes strategies that optimally address co-pollutants. Now, we can apply this EJ approach to renewable energy and Solarized campaigns in particular. Just as consumption of fossil fuels generates nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, the production of solar utilizes silicon tetrachloride, hydrofluoric acid, cadmium, and other toxins that disproportionately harm poor communities of color. And we can conceptualize these latter hazards as the co-pollutants of the minimal greenhouse gas emissions generated by solar production. And with this in mind, EJ solar campaigns can move beyond the narrow focus on reducing electricity bills and greenhouse gases and address environmental injustices through strategies that reduce co-pollutants across solar supply chains, which is to say that a shift to co-pollutants calls on us to not merely reduce a single metric of harm, but rather to attenuate multiple metrics of harm across communities of color at every point of the supply chain. And we can then pragmatically incorporate the co-pollutant framework into Solarized campaigns by transforming how we leverage economies of scale. This could entail three things. First, this entails shifting the campaign focus from consumer power to people power. Second, this entails broadening Solarized purchasing pools in ways that reflect this shift. And finally, this entails working toward supply chain solidarity between communities of color that produce solar infrastructure and communities of color that consume such infrastructure. So I'll now lay out these three interventions. So first, let's start with shifting the focus from consumer power to people power. Now, as I discussed, the formation of large purchasing pools is a fairly pragmatic way of overcoming marginalized communities' financial barriers to solar. But this rationale solidifies market logics that suggest that social change is best secured through individuals' consumer choices. The co-pollutants frameworks really troubles this logic by exposing the ways in which a premium on consumer price reductions in poor communities of color in the global north can generate toxins in poor communities of color in the global south. And with this in mind, the first step to incorporating a co-pollutants framework into a Solarized campaign is to simply acknowledge that any effort to achieve economies of scale in the energy sector necessarily reproduces extractive and exploitative systems as evinced by, again, the distribution of co-pollutants. And with this acknowledgement in place, campaign organizers can begin to shift their campaign's economies of scale approach from consumer power to people power. Instead of focusing on generating a broad pool of consumers who leverage their purchasing power toward cost reductions, campaigns could focus on generating a critical mass of people who leverage their collective power to create a regenerative economy that works to limit co-pollutants in all communities, including industrial communities in China. Such a shift in focus could take shape through a simple campaign mission statement, the articulation of goals at campaign meetings, or a written theory of change. And with this sort of very basic formal articulation in place, we can actually pursue strategies to address co-pollutants in Solarized campaigns, which brings me to my second intervention, broadening Solarized purchasing pools. So once Solarized campaigns commit to shifting from consumer power to people power, they can operationalize this commitment by expanding their purchasing pools from the local level to the citywide or the regional level, focusing their efforts on mass movement building, essentially. And this would entail rejecting a narrow organizing ethos focused on targeting individual consumers in a particular geographic market, and instead generating a broad-based organizing effort centered on communities of color working in solidarity with one another. Expansive regional purchasing pools committed to environmental justice could better leverage the power of marginalized communities to minimize co-pollutants by demanding concessions of industry that go far beyond simple price reductions. Specifically, community groups in contiguous communities of color across local and state borders can cooperate on larger Solarized campaigns that target wider swaths of buildings. And these partnerships could then collaboratively issue RFPs for accredited solar contractors to install multiple megawatts of residential solar across multiple properties regionally. And a campaign that pledges to reach this sort of scale would represent a level of consumer demand far greater than what most residential solar contractors are accustomed to. As a result, the sheer scale has the potential to give EJ activists a level of leverage in demanding environmental justice benefits and supply chain transparency from contractors, including certain high-quality labor credentials, supply chain monitoring, high-end procurement, and codified commitments to anti-racist business practices that could collectively minimize co-pollutants. And at the most rudimentary level, this could entail including really basic contractor prerequisites in a Solarized RFP. So such an RFP could, for instance, require that all contractors who submit a proposal source their products from companies that adhere to the Solar Energy Industry Association standards or similar standards, such as SGS's internationally recognized certifications. Contractors who adhere to these really basic sourcing standards and submit a proposal could then be screened according to a point system that rewards contractors that ethically monitor their supply chains. So currently, Solarize RFPs evaluate contractors' proposed pricing, their system design, the quality of equipment and products, their implementation plan, and their commitment to workforce training or hiring. But quality of equipment and products really narrowly focuses on solar panel efficiency and a host of technology warranties. An expanded Solarize campaign with more leverage could introduce other markers of product quality to minimize co-pollutants, such as the use of recycled materials or less toxic heavy metals or less noxious alternatives like zinc sulfide, or the documenting of labor, environmental, and human rights screenings in solar supply chains. And in addition to quality of products, other standards could be put in place following the Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition Solar Scorecard, whereby contractors could get points in the Solarize evaluation process for sourcing from companies that don't use conflict minerals or for participating in a recycling or take-back program. Now, these really rather basic innovations to the Solarize RFP process obviously can't unilaterally raise the industry standards of transparency, but instead they represent a starting point for a more robust process of leveraging economies of scale to minimize co-pollutants in local Solarize campaigns. And I know I'm nearing my time, but I'm almost done. So the final step in incorporating a co-pollutants framework into a Solarize campaign is to make common cause with communities and workers burdened by co-pollutants on the back end of solar supply chains. And this can entail both reviewing reports on the workforce hazards of local solar manufacturing and forming alliances with activists and workers in the various industries that manufacture solar infrastructure to better identify their burdens and demands. So for example, Black and Latinx EJ activists in the global north can reach out to transnational organizations like China Labor Watch and China Labor Bulletin, which support worker activists in China's sprawling manufacturing sector, to understand the unique harms that workers are facing and identify improvements that can minimize co-pollutants, thereby improving worker and community safety. Connecting with such organizations could also enable EJ activists to foster alliances with on-the-ground workers and deepen their vision for a regenerative economy. Activists could then draw from such alliances to develop standards for reducing co-pollutants through the expanded Solarize purchasing pools that I just proposed. So this proposed praxis for transforming local solar campaigns is grounded in the environmental justice movement's recognition that communities of color are subjugated by environmental degradation in comparable ways across spaces from the global south to the global north. And my hope is that this proposed community solar praxis really builds on the movement's longstanding efforts to challenge and innovate mainstream environmental paradigms, continuing the work that communities of color have always engaged in to challenge the destruction of their environments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myles, for that really amazing presentation. We'll hold on all questions until the end, obviously, so let's move right on to Alana now.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Alana. I'm a PhD candidate with the UTS Climate Justice Research Centre here in Sydney. Before I start today, I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. My research has taken place predominantly on the lands of the Bundjalung and the Anawan people. And I also pay my respects to their elders in Australia and in other countries around the world when we're talking about energy justice. there can be no energy justice until there is First Nations energy justice. The land that I'm on always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I grew up in a town called Singleton, which is one of the most populous centres of the Hunter Valley, which is one of Australia's largest coal mining regions. That image in the lower left corner here is a picture of one of many open cut coal mines that Singleton is home to. For anybody that's never seen an open cut coal mine, I don't really want to say I highly recommend it, but I do highly recommend it to get an understanding of just how massive and horrifying and environmentally and ecologically destructive open cut mining is. But yeah, through growing up in a coal mining town, I guess I became very aware and increasingly interested in the social and ecological impacts of mining, social, both good and bad. And that kind of carried me through into, leaving Singleton, going to university, becoming involved in the climate movement. And yeah, for the last decade, over a decade now, actually, I've been involved in the climate justice movement here in Australia. For probably the first 5 or so years of my involvement, I was focused predominantly on looking at transitions away from fossil fuels. And I felt like, as somebody who came from a coal mining town, I helped to bring a voice that is really important in the climate justice movement, which is thinking about the towns that currently rely on fossil fuels and other polluting and extractive industries. Probably about 10 years ago, that it wasn't a huge conversation in Australia. But yeah, thankfully, the voices of these communities have been heard, and there's been some really incredible work done. And yeah, so there is more of a conversation in Australia at the moment around what just transitions away from fossil fuels look like. But yeah, probably about 5 years ago now, I started thinking about what does the other side look like. There's a lot of discussion and even starting to be action on what transitions away from fossil fuels look like. But yeah, I started becoming quite interested in, well, what would a just transition to renewables look like within Australia? And yeah, so that's what I've been looking at for the last 5 years and what my PhD research is focusing on. I'm in my 4th and hopefully final year of my PhD, so I'm in the process of writing up at the moment. So yeah, essentially what my project is has come to is that I see there being a spectrum of possibilities when we're talking about transitions to renewable energy or transformations to decarbon societies. That there's a whole heap of different ways that we could see these new transitions and these new ways of living coming about. And on one end, I kind of see business as usual, green capitalists, eco-modern techno-utopias on one end, and then another end is Indigenous, eco-feminist, recommoning futures and heaps of other possibilities in between. And so part of what I've been really interested in is not only exploring what these possibilities are starting to look like in Australia, but also bringing that conversation to the climate justice movement. The energy justice movement in Australia is quite fledgling. We've been quite stuck on conversations around coal because I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with Australian politics, but the coal industry here is all powerful, and even discussing transitioning away from coal is a very difficult conversation. And so, yeah, the climate movement here has been quite stuck on that conversation. And as I guess as the movement becomes increasingly urgent in wanting to see action, the justice principles kind of can fall to the side, and there is a bit of a rhetoric around transition to renewable energy in any way possible. And yeah, me personally, somebody that's heavily invested in energy justice, I don't want to see that happen. As somebody who grew up in a coal mining town, I don't want kids who grow up in future renewable energy centers to find out that they have a extractivist industry on their hands. So yeah, that's part of where my research has been coming from. The concepts that I've landed on is looking at the Marxist concept of alienation, and then some materialist ecofeminists have taken those concepts of alienation and come up with what they call de-alienation remedies. So Marx had 4 concepts of alienation, which is alienation from the labor process, alienation from product, alienation from others, and alienation from self and nature. I was originally fitting all 4 in, but I've recently been told by my supervisor that that's not going to be possible, and I can only do 2. So yeah, I'm now just focusing on alienation from others and alienation from self and nature. And through a comparative framework, I'm looking at large-scale corporate renewable energy projects in rural Australia, or rural New South Wales, which is the state that I live in and Australia's most populous state. And the flip side, looking at community, so kind of smaller mid-scale community renewable energy projects. And using these concepts of alienation and de-alienation to explore whether these projects are kind of furthering a sense of alienation, or if they're helping people to reintegrate with one another. Similarly, if they're furthering alienation from self and nature, or if they're projects that are helping to dismantle the human nature separation. And it's probably not particularly shocking what I'm finding. So these are some of my initial results for along the spectrum of possibilities, as I'm calling it. The large-scale corporate projects that I've been looking at, are eco-modernist, green capitalism, focusing on capital accumulation and enclosure of lands, and in some attempts, the sun and wind, whereas community projects are more up the end of the recommoning, de-alienation, eco-socialism. Corporate projects, again, unsurprisingly, have more of a focus on the financial and technological aspects of renewable energy, whereas community projects have a greater focus on social and ecological aspects. Corporate projects tend to be male dominated and focus on, I guess, what are typically in Western society considered more masculine forms of labor. Women do tend to be involved, but they're mostly involved in admin, communications, or community engagement roles. And those roles aren't particularly valued. Whereas in community projects, projects are more gender diverse. There's a skewing towards what's, again, kind of socialized as women's labor, and women are more likely to be in leadership, organizing, and strategic roles. Corporate projects, again, not surprising, is a for-profit model and a model that seeks to grow our energy. For example, in Australia, there's a pretty big campaign around trying to get Australia to be at 700% renewables, so that we can become an energy superpower and export, sell our energy around the world. Whereas community projects are typically not-for-profit projects or social enterprises where the profits are reinvested back into the local community. And for many of these projects, energy degrowth is an explicit goal. Corporate projects, business as usual rhetoric, nothing has to change except the source of our energy. community projects, there's quite often an explicit critique of socioeconomic, eco-social relations and systems around energy in Australia. Corporate projects typically have bare minimum engagement with traditional custodians, basically just get up to the point that are required in planning laws, and that's about it. Community projects vary widely, and it's definitely an area that needs improvement. Some projects, and this would be the fewer, deeply consider and co-design with traditional custodians. Others have almost no engagement at all, and indeed kind of continue what is known in Australia as like terra nullius thinking and acting, which is how this land came to be colonized in the first place. So yeah, my current conclusion, I'm in the writing up phase at the moment, is that while we do have projects in Australia that are seeking to build energy justice and that are contributing towards de-alienation to an extent, because they're piecemeal projects, they inevitably come up against the systems that were built for settler fossil capital and become constrained or altered so much that they're basically unrecognizable from the original vision. Whereas even though there has been some difficulty for large scale projects, particularly around, we have a bit of an ongoing conversation in Australia, conflict around moving to renewables and staying with coal. Large scale corporate projects do have an easier time of getting up than community projects. This, of course, does not mean we shouldn't try. It just means that we need to recognize that we can't just change the technology. We need to be making sure that we're changing the systems and our eco-social relations while we're decarbonizing society as well. So I will leave it there. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with everyone in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Alana. Another terrific presentation. Let me then invite Jéssica to give her presentation.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to have heard the previous presentations, and I'm looking forward to our talking together. Please let me know when you can see my screen. I think it should be visible now. Is it?
It is.
Great. So first, I want to thank the committee, the organizing committee, for the invitation. I'm so honored to be able to have this dialogue with the people who have presented before me and who will do after me. And my name is Jéssica Coyotecatl, and I'm a PhD student in the Anthropology department, where I found a community of scholars who are really interested in understanding what energy justice from a global perspective means. And I want to make a plug here that we're developing an energy justice syllabus. And I've heard before that there's interest of keeping this conversation going, so I'm sure we want to get in on that, and I just want to say that. And I'm coming to you from Santa Barbara, which is a Chumash territory, and I want to acknowledge that. So in this presentation, I want to talk about what energy justice might mean during Mexico's sovereign transition. And I'm presenting from my fieldwork in central Mexico in the states of Tlaxcala, Puebla, and Morelos, and for a project that, even though it's a very old project, it's almost 20 years in the making, now it's becoming a central focus of the current government. So barely 2 months into office, the new president, so-called leftist president Andrés Manuel López Obrador, declared that he was going to have a participatory exercise. And well, there's so much to say about that, but let's just call it an illegal exercise because it's not contemplated in the Mexican Constitution. And he presented a ballot. And in the ballot, he was talking about how whether people, the participatory exercise is a one person, one vote kind of votes from a selected region. he selected the region, and they were going to decide whether the one thermoelectric plant should operate. That was the question. And then he eventually changed the ballot, and it was about now the Morelos Comprehensive Project. And there's a lot to say about these changes, but what I want to highlight here is the change between calling it about one thermoelectric plant and then calling it a Morelos Comprehensive Project. And that's a big difference, because a plant is very localized, and then the Morelos Comprehensive Project is a regional project that is located in the center of Mexico. It's three-state-wide project, and that's the key that I want to focus on here. Not everyone was very involved or wanted to participate in this exercise. So Samir Flores Soberanes was an Nahua indigenous leader, one of the recognizable faces in the organized opposition against this Morelos Comprehensive Project, and he was assassinated just 3 days before the consultation, this exercise happened. And he was called by just 10 days before this exercise. The president called them extremist leftist people. And I think that's a very important situation, because it addresses one of the key issues I want to think about in my dissertation and in this presentation, is who is the we that it talks about when we talk about sovereignty transition or sovereign transitions. And AMLO is referring to we, the nation, the people, and he deliberately excluded some people from this from this nation. And another important, I just want to show that in this image that I'm showing, Samir is having an image of Zapata, who is a very important leader from the revolution in Mexico from a century ago. So despite international outcry, the exercise happened, and some people participated, and yet they reported the results of this exercise as part of a collective response. So in that it says triumph of the people, honor to Zapata, and dignity to the people. And some other people refused to participate in this exercise, and then they burned the ballots, and they didn't allow it to happen. But yet some other people were saying that we have said no to this project before, not to this thermoelectric plant, but to this project, to this effort to transform the territory. And we have said it for 10 years now, and we will continue saying that. And then we can see the other we that we encounter in this discussion about what a sovereign energy transition might mean. So the Morelos, so instead of being a thermoelectric plant, the Morelos Comprehensive Project is a very large scale project that involves 3 states in central Mexico. It involves 2 thermoelectric plants, not one gas pipeline, natural gas pipeline, and 1 aqueduct. And it's located surrounding the base of an active volcano, the Popocatépetl volcano, it's been active since 1997, and that's one of the key issues. Why they're calling this a dead project, because they're saying it's so dangerous to put a natural gas pipeline and a thermoelectric plant in its base. And you can see here that there are different lines for the pipeline, and I will get into that in a second, but they all fall within the zone of that a possible eruption will affect in this region. So since a lot of towns have rejected the pipeline, this is a very old project. So the first knowledge we have about this project is before the turn of the century, but so it has changed its line several times. And we can see here is we did a mapping exercise in 2012 when they were still not, the pipeline was not yet buried. And we see that there were a lot of different projections for the pipeline. So we can see that they were crossing different regions, different communities, and it has been moving around. But as I said, it's a very old project. But with the new government, this was the new government declared the need for an energy transition that will be sovereign. And the key to that issue is that it became a matter of national security. And therefore, the final layout of this pipeline is now restricted to the people and to everyone. So it's classified and they cannot know where it is. And how to understand energy justice? I think that's a key question. And for me, unlike I've heard some of other presenters have said, they first arrived to the issue of energy studies through a climate concern, right? Through a climate change concern. However, for me, it happened the other way around. First, I was involved with peasants and indigenous struggles about their land, that in one of these struggles is related to energy. So I think that's a key issue for me to listen to what people and how people are seeing these projects involved in a longer history of different projects by the Mexican state. And I'm sure our chair can talk more about about those kind of projects. But I think that's very important, taking seriously the history that people are seeing these projects fitting in. And in the case of this Morelos Comprehensive Project, it relates to the revolution, to the haciendas time, and more recently to other infrastructural projects like highways and the industrial development of the region. That's from the late 90s. So another key issue to understand this is that infrastructure, then see it as a process addressing what, and that's from Ashley Cars, understanding infrastructure as a longer process is not just about the moment it's built or the moment it starts functioning, but it's about how it's maintained and how it needs sustenance, continuous sustenance to produce. So it's a built environment, whether it's built of concrete or it's trees, it's still built. So it's a process. And then we have something from political ecology from Latin America. That's very much what Alana was talking about, very close to that, about the commoning and what is this built environment that is collective. And that is not necessarily a very pristine environment, but something that we have responsibilities to and we get benefits from, and we have different relationships to. And then we enter in this discussion of what sovereignty might mean. And I think there's an important tension there between what happens with sovereignty in the so-called United States or in the so-called Mexico. And we can see that with intellectuals like White and Nick Estes, who are saying, well, perhaps we need to think about sovereignty, but what happens when a national government is claiming that sovereignty? And in this case, they're claiming it against other countries, but then the communities are saying, but at the expense of whom, right? So they're saying, should we still talk about sovereignty, or are there other terms that might be useful to think about energy? And finally, I think in the case of Mexico, there's a lot written about violence, and specifically is related to what is now called like the narco violence. But I think there's some other violence that is less paid attention to, which is state violence. State violence and how it's very tied to the extractive industry and is part of that extractive industry. So that's why I think I'm bringing a lot of different things, and I think that's why ethnography can work very well in this point, because it's very place-based and allows you to make these jumps between scales and time and addressing different issues that people are bringing to this discussion. So there's another type of consultation happening. as I said, this is a very large project and is located in a very long inhabited zone. However, only few of these communities are recognized as indigenous population. And in one of these, in four of these, four small communities are recognized as indigenous communities, and they have sued the Mexican state because Mexico is a signature of the ILO 169 treaty. That it says that the indigenous people should have free and informed prior consult, and that didn't happen in this case. So now it's happening. It's halted because of COVID, but it started. So what they're saying is bringing this free and prior consultation, even if it's 6 years after the fact. It's happening in these indigenous recognized communities, but there are also these ejido communities, which is another form of class-based collectiveness, and that brings into question longer histories of working the land. So when in this consultation, what they are discussing is what is the future of this pipeline. Specifically, what is the future of this pipeline? But if we don't know where the pipeline is, and I think that that's what brought me this question of what is the where is the pipeline? And so we did this mapping project, and in this mapping project, even though we don't know where it is, we don't have a final markers with global position system markers. We do have these markers in the land. And we also have these yellow markers in the land, but we also have the scars in the land. So this picture was taken in 2019 in this mapping project, and it's 6 years after the pipeline was buried, and you can still see in the landscape, you can see the line where the pipeline was buried. And that's very important to the people I was talking with, because they were seeing the moment where the full force of the Mexican state make sure the pipeline happened. And so it was the military, it was the police, the state, local, municipal police, they all came to make sure the pipeline will be in there. There were people who were incarcerated, persecuted, harassed. So they remember that, and seeing that, so the landscape and the memory are connected. And I think that's very important. And as I said, the COVID-19 halted that consultation. So I think anthropology can do another thing, which is having, usually it's tied to traditional ecological knowledge, but I think there's other forms of knowledge that anthropologists are or could be good at making sure the conversations happens. So we had this forum, this series of webinars where we talked about, one of the things we talked about was the geological impacts of this Morelos comprehensive project. So we bring together other forms of science that is not with traditional ecological knowledges, and I think we can make fruitful conversations that allow us to still see that the pipeline, it is there, but for the people it is still a question. It's not yet functioning, so it's still something they can change, and I think that's very important. So finally, what is energy justice? And the things I keep coming back to is that we really need to take into account state projects, and how in this case, there's a mestizo project that has make indigenous people the source of exploitation, or who are they going to exploit? Okay, so therefore we also need to take a broader sense of what violence is, so we can think about what justice might mean, so it's not just procedural, right? And finally, as I said, the future is not set. People are still, even though the pipeline was built, they still see it as not set and not definitive, and I think that's a very important lesson to learn there, and that alternatives are in the making. I did not cover any of those alternatives in this, but they are happening throughout. And again, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to talking with you.
Thank you so much, Jéssica. Again, wonderful presentation. Let me just remind everyone listening or watching that the Q&A is open, so please do go ahead and put your questions in, especially as we're moving after the next presentation to discussion. That final presentation will be Nikki's. So Nikki, do you want to take us away?
Sure. Thank you, Dominic, and thank you everyone who put so much work into organizing this conference, and to the previous presenters on this panel. It gives me a lot to think about, and throughout this discussion, throughout this conference, I've seen so many fantastic discussions, and I'm just honored to be here with you today. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to be reading my presentation, but I want to begin with a statement that a group I work with in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'll be talking about today, begins every meeting that we have, that acknowledges intersectional demands for land back, which are critical to energy justice. Noting that the economy of Georgia was built upon the slavery of African people and people of color, and that Atlanta currently occupies the homeland of the Cherokee, Muskogee, and Chickasaw people, who we honor as custodians past and present. Today in Knoxville, the land I'm on is part of the traditional territory of the Tsalagi peoples, now the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and the United Kiowa Band of Cherokee Indians, as well as the Soyaha peoples of the Yuchi and Muskogee Creek. So thank you all again. So I want to say that my comments today are based on a forthcoming paper in the journal Environment and Planning E. And that's part of a special issue on electricity capital that I am in the process of co-editing with Matt Huber. In the paper titled Powering Racial Capitalism, Electricity, Rate Making, and the Uneven Geographies of Atlanta, examine community organizing for energy democracy within the regulatory arena of the Georgia Public Service Commission, to challenge how the regulated, investor-owned, and I think important to note, since we're at least digitally in Houston, the vertically integrated electric utility Georgia Power contributes to racialized energy burden in Atlanta. This work built out of my PhD research on the politics of green jobs policy in Atlanta. And present in my interviews with organizers, contractors, and environmentalists was an insistence that green job creation and training must be situated within a wider frame of concerns about energy and the ways in which energy can contribute to the reproduction of inequality. My talk today is based on these interviews and observation at rallies, town halls, and regulatory hearings that I attended, which pushed me to dig deeper into the history of electricity regulation. And today I'll bring some of that research into conversation with community education and organizing around energy burden and the 2019 Georgia rate case. So in June of 2019, Georgia Power, which provides electricity to 2.6 million households in Georgia, including those in Atlanta, released a proposal to increase electric rates for the first time in 6 years. The announcement galvanized months of statewide organizing, including letter writing, public testimony, and demonstrations from racial justice, faith, and environmental organizations who protested the company's slow action to address climate change, limited investment in residential renewable energy and energy efficiency, and failure to consider how the proposed increase of an estimated $16.48 a month for the average household would exacerbate the exorbitant and unequal cost of electricity across the state. In a rally to fight the hike outside the commission building in downtown Atlanta at the end of the first day of hearings before the commission, a group of predominantly Black Georgia Power customers gathered to protest the rate increase. One woman put it simply, quote, "We ask for $15 an hour and we're told it's not feasible. Now we know this increase is coming and there's been no increase on our side." She argued that electricity is entangled in the reproduction of what geographer Willie Wright terms racialized uneven development in the city, and questioned why the company, permitted by the commission, profits as people who live in poverty struggle to pay their light bills. The effects of high utility bills are significant in Atlanta, which has among the highest median energy burdens in the country. In low-income neighborhoods, energy bills consume 10% of household budgets, outpacing the 6% threshold often used to define affordable energy, and more than double the metro area median of 5% of household income. Community organizing around the rate case reframed energy burden as a collective problem, to contest the operation of corporate electricity networks that reproduce uneven development, and to demand access to affordable and low carbon electricity. Beginning from the historical position that capitalism has always been racial capitalism, which relies upon and reinforces racial difference in the organization, growth, and ideological legitimation of capitalist practices. I bring together literature on racial capitalism and energy justice that considers the gendered, racialized, class, national, and tribal disparities in utility service disconnections and access to renewable energy and energy efficiency in the energy transition. My contribution is to ask how state infrastructures of regulation and rate making make possible the commodification of electricity and do so in ways that contribute to the spatialized production of energy burden. Regulation does not mean that electricity is recognized as a minimum basic service or need for a healthy and dignified life. Rather, the commodification of electricity is bound up in liberal understandings of individualism, democratic citizenship, and personal responsibility that, according to Jody Melamed, quote, fortify racial capitalist processes of spatial and social differentiation that truncate relationality for capital accumulation. In other words, regulators secure electricity capital in the public interest, yet disregard the historical and contemporary relations that differentiate what members of the public are able to afford. Organizing for energy democracy situates energy unaffordability within state systems of racial governance that define the built environment through processes of redlining, urban renewal, and gentrification that contribute to uneven access to quality housing and living wage employment in order to reframe energy affordability as a public concern. I consider the historical geographical construction of racialized disparities in energy burden in the context of Atlanta, where after the US Civil War, civic officials guided by a New South ideology promised shared economic prosperity and social uplift under a strict white supremacist racial hierarchy. Electricity powered the modernization of the New South, city as it termed itself. Georgia Power's predecessor was founded in 1883 and quickly grew to power streetlights, businesses, and streetcars. Following 2 decades of rapid population growth, the created population competition for jobs and municipal services. In 1906, a white mob instigated a violent riot on the electric streetcar system that transformed the geography of the city and its utility. In its aftermath, white working class customers militated for public takeover of the streetcars to enforce racial segregation laws. Instead, at the request of electric companies, the state legislature adopted a bill to regulate electricity under the Railroad Commission, later renamed the Public Service Commission, and to allow statewide election on an at-large basis for commission seats. The expansion, historian Casey Cater argues that this responded to, quote, popular demands for the enlargement of white democracy, yet because the expansion of popular control over electric companies was followed by an amendment in the state constitution the following year to disenfranchise African-American voters. Regulation, however, served to benefit the utility company. Georgia Power has worked closely with the public service commissioners to manage the infrastructure that renders electricity saleable. This regulatory framework formalized the utility as not part of, but rather acting within the purview of state government, which protected the non-competitive service territory that ensured demand for the company's product and thus also profits for investors. In turn, the commission regulates Georgia Power's fuel mix, how much the company charges for their services. Rates are not based on the cost of producing electricity, but rather on the capital expenditures the company takes on to build, finance, and operate infrastructure. This accounting design incentivized constant construction and advertising to generate new demand and justify increasing capitalization, which Richard Hirsch famously names the grow and build model. And Manning Marable observed made the Southern Company, Georgia Power's parent company, quote, a forum for the coordination of electric power with the financial and industrial development of the colonial economy of the South. Georgia Power was an important regional booster and recruited businesses to the region with the promise of low labor costs, low taxes, and low energy costs. In addition to providing discounted rates for large power customers, the utility promoted energy intensification of homes and businesses through advertisements tailored to white homemakers for air conditioning, electric water heating, kitchen appliances, as well as subsidized sales of machinery. In turn, the company profited as electricity-powered Georgia's growing suburban expanse. And as the region's population increased, Georgia Power's total annual electric sales mushroomed. Despite flatlining demand since 2010, the company has continued to invest in costly construction projects for which ratepayers are ultimately responsible. In 2019, the Fight the Hike campaign I mentioned at the beginning of my comments brought together a coalition of stakeholders to organize and advocate with low-income communities and communities of color for a more just energy system in the regulatory proceedings before the commission. In hearing rooms, town halls, and rallies like the one I described, individuals gathered to make demands for the publicly elected commission to represent the needs of poor and working Georgians in their rate-making decisions. Despite more than 20,000 people calling in or emailing opposition to the rate hike, the commission eventually approved an agreement between Georgia Power and its largest customers that resulted in increasing fees for residential customers by $4 a month, while granting the company a generous 10.5% rate of return, such that Georgia Power, according to the public interest lawyer for the Public Service Commission, will annually reap more than $330 million a year above the national average in profit. Organizing around energy burden targets these state and corporate networks that manage energy infrastructure as one way to address the historical geographical production of racialized and gendered poverty in the city. In the years since the rate case was decided, organizers who were part of this campaign have continued to fight the racist political economy of electricity through efforts to expand on-bill financing for residential energy efficiency, implement a percent of income payment plan to cap bills for low-income people, and challenge that method of statewide at-large voting for the commission under the Voting Rights Act, that, according to a lawsuit brought by the NAACP and Black Voters Matter, means the statewide white majority can defeat the candidates preferred by Black voters. Politicizing and activating customers has involved in ongoing and public interrogation of the historical roots of the relationship between the utility and commission in the Jim Crow era, and the rate-making process that allows a private company to profit from electric bills that are unaffordable to some Georgians. This advocacy, educational, and electoral work strives to make visible the racialized inequity in the energy system and the intimate connections that people have to the state and company through their everyday uses of electricity. In a critique of racial capitalism, Ruth Wilson Gilmore conceptualizes state systems that do not reproduce racism. And instead, building from Stuart Hall, she envisions, quote, non-fatal couplings of power and difference that would nourish other kinds of relations such as mutuality. Considering the intimate moments and relations connected through the electric grid offers a strategic organizing logic to contest and reimagine the utility. In questioning the accumulation paradigm that underlies the operation of racialized electricity capital, energy justice organizers in Atlanta point the way to an energy system that could power life-affirming relations and support community needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And you know, one of the sad things about Zoom is you never get to hear applause. So I'm going to turn my mic on and I'm going to applaud for all four of you. Thank you so much for brilliant, fascinating, informative, challenging, provocative presentations that I think really, get us, you have put so many issues on the table that are important for thinking about energy justice. So I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of being the chair, the panel chair, to ask a question or two while other folks articulate, think over their thoughts and put them into writing. But again, please, everyone, do put your questions you have into the Q&A. Here's a question for I think for any of you, because I think all of you have put forward two of the crucial problems. One is, what exactly do we mean when we say energy justice? Is this a universal and fairly transparent state of affairs? Or is it something that really needs, all of us are field researchers here, that really needs the field research to tease out what exactly does justice mean in particular communities, in particular times? Even thinking along the supply chain solidarity that Myles was talking about, does justice mean the same thing at one end of the chain as the other? So that would be the first question. The second question you're going to anticipate is sort of how do we get there too? I think all of your presentations did address these both. but I really want to sort of spotlight that one question because I'm sure people listening in would love to hear your thoughts about it. Does anyone want to take that? What is energy justice? Is it the same everywhere, or do we really need to be thinking about how justice is defined locally?
I'm happy to start.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that justice does mean different things for different locations and different people. Here in Australia, energy justice does mean, reckoning with our, horrifying colonial history, which is ongoing. And, that does need to be front and center. How we get there is, a really big challenge, because as I kind of alluded to in my presentation, I would say that when we're talking about energy justice in Australia, not that many people that are involved in what are also being called energy democracy projects are really thinking through those relations and that kind of, the original injustice of this land, which is dispossession and ongoing dispossession. So for Australia as a continent, as a nation state at this point in time, I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and one that, of course, the leadership for how we do address that is coming from First Nations communities. And there is some work being done within the climate justice movement in Australia to kind of build those relationships and raise the voices and I guess the power of First Nations communities. But particularly in these like community energy projects that I'm looking at, which most people would kind of see as like, I guess, like a frontier of energy justice or community energy in Australia. It really varies how people consider that kind of original injustice, and in some cases they're not really considering at all. And so for me, that's one of like the biggest challenges that I guess for this land. But yeah, keen to hear what other people think.
Yeah, have I? Okay, great. I definitely agree with Alana that there's no one framework for energy justice. And in fact, I want to make a claim that might ruffle a lot of our feathers in the wrong way as people that are scholars that care about precision. But I wonder if it's even worthwhile to try to establish some sort of definitional precision around energy justice. I see it less as sort of a concept that we can affiliate a clear reference to, and more a heuristic that is affective, that is around calling attention to the fact that energy is a matter of justice, and in the process inspiring people to take action and to think about energy as a question of justice. Too often energy sort of falls to the backdrop as an infrastructure that we take for granted. Even people who struggle to pay their bills, even people for whom energy is very precarious, that precarity even has a mundane quality in some instances, which is not to minimize the difficulty in paying one's bills, but it's to suggest that it's often a regular part of just struggling and surviving. And the idea of energy justice is to say, this mundane topic, this thing that infuses every facet of our lives, actually has implications for thinking about what a just society is. And I think that if we try to go down the rabbit hole of trying to conceptualize it in any clear way, we find very clearly that not only does energy justice mean different things to different people in different contexts, but also that any of those particular contexts contradict one another. And so I do think that we want to confront those contradictions, and it's incumbent on all of us as scholars, as activists, and people who care about the world to have a normative baseline of the world that we hope to see, and to try to see through it, and to try to see that through, and to minimize the contradictions. But even so, I think that it's okay to have a level of fluidity around the concept, because if the idea of energy justice allows someone to address energy burden, for instance, then that is a great thing. And the idea of energy justice allows someone to think about indigenous land rights, then that's a great thing. If it allows someone to conceptualize the supply chains of renewable energy technologies, then that's a great thing. And if we put all those things together, we will see that sometimes those things don't align perfectly. But that's okay. And so I would just urge all of us to be sort of okay with the open-endedness of a term like that.
If I can
Yes,
build off
please,
of
Jéssica.
that. Yeah, I was just thinking that, as I mentioned, for me, the concept of nations are so problematic. It's built on so many legacies, as Alana was saying, on so ongoing legacies of extraction and colonialism, that I think an energy justice frame might allow for thinking and well, of thinking of new ways of even internationalism. What does it mean to where are the boundaries, right? And not to make it like just energy. I think a lot of scholars, we do this, right? Our thing is the most important thing to study, but just to think about as part of the array of things that we need to transform for those energy futures. And I think that's, for me, the key question there: what is the future, and who is going to make the decisions? Because I believe that the world is produced, right? We produce the world we have, and then this energy, as Myles was saying, it allows a framework to think about who is doing this thinking and who is doing it with, and who is doing it for, and at the expenses of whom. And for me, that's the key also of energy justice: try to link it back to the energy of people, right? People working, and labor issues. So that's something I really notice about Nikki's talk, and that's so important to link back the scalar thing of it, trying to bring back the energy of humans into these energy regimes, because that's, for me, what the future is about.
That's such a nice way of putting it, Jessica, because I mean, it really connects to what Myles was just saying too about it's not so much that we need a kind of, ordained from above stable concept of what this is. The most important thing is that people feel, like they're not being exploited, and that they have a future that they have control over. And that's in part, I think, what you were bringing up about sovereignty too. There's sovereignty of the soil, and then there's a sense of sovereignty over one's sort of embodied ability to help make a future in as part of a collective. And that those are two different ways of thinking about what sovereignty is, both very important. But unfortunately, the nation state model of sovereignty is the one that has the most guns, the most violence, the most ability to impose itself. Which I think leads to the second question I wanted to pose to you, which is, again, unfair and large, but I mean, let's have fun with it, right? If we're going to move towards justice, all of your papers spoke to the deep legacies that we're facing, the fact that you have racial capitalism, colonialism, that liberalism, in fact, in many ways, that informs the democratic institutions in all of the countries we've talked about today. Liberalism itself has, its deep connections to colonialism and extraction as well. So we're up against, a major challenge. And I'm interested, though, because I think all of you have an appreciation for the fact that, the committed purpose-driven action, even by small groups of people, has transformative capacity. And I wondered if any of you had any thoughts about, what do we do to sort of disrupt these extractive legacies of that certainly were, absolutely ruled the roost in the peak of the fossil fuel era, but that we're hoping that with the transition will be at least to some extent dismantled, right? So, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, Myles, but you did speak directly to this. I think you gave a kind of a sort of a series of steps. In your thinking, where should we be concentrating our political energy in this process? Whether it's at the voting booth or on the streets or, in shareholder meetings like they did at Exxon the other day, what's your thought?
Yeah, this is a great question. And actually, to respond, I want to come back to the points that Alana was really forcefully making about the importance of relationality and drawing from that framework of de-alienation, because I see that as really central or needs to be central to how we think about doing a comprehensive politics that addresses extractive legacies of our industrialized energy system. Because Dominic, you just listed several kinds of interventions that one can make, and we know that they have various forms of efficacy. They operate at different scales, and I think that always when we're talking about trying to keep the fossil fuels in the ground and move to renewable energy future, we want to be doing everything that we can on as many scales as possible. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think that work of trying to operate on multiple scales needs to be complemented with a skepticism of a utopia and a moving beyond the sort of polemics of what in the United States we often call a just transition. Because and I'll bring this back to Alana's point in a second about relationality and how that ties in, but when we think about a just transition in terms of the grand stakes of we need to have 100% renewable energy, community owned, community operated, that recognizes indigenous sovereignty, that creates local jobs, all of those things in many respects can be possible, and they're things worth focusing on and fighting for. But I think that our energy system is so enmeshed in modes of, Alana, you talked about alienation, just a distancing from shoot, I'm forgetting his name. Well, forget that for a second. So just the entire process of thinking about energy as something that we can own and produce and generate more of to survive through an industrialized infrastructure at an industrial scale, regardless of what the fuel input is, has origins in slavery, in colonialism, and an extractive understanding of the world, an extractive way of relating to the world. And insofar as that's the case, no matter what intervention we take, whether if that is ratepayer legislation, whether if that is that incredible work of the shareholder activists with Exxon recently, whatever form that takes, necessarily, if we're talking about industrialized energy, we are talking about these extractive legacies that inhere in just the materiality of in utility scale industrial system, right? Like that's not something that we just get rid of, even if we put low-income communities or communities of color, indigenous communities in charge of the technology that we rely on to produce electricity, heat, and fuels. And so that work, as important as it is, I think needs to be complemented by work to just try to have some relations with the forms of life that sustain us. And it's precisely that absence of a connection with the forms of life that sustain us that make our industrialized energy system so pernicious and insidious. So I'll just stop there because I know I'm going on and on, but hopefully those connections are clear, and I'd be curious to hear what other sorts of, how others might deepen this sort of broad idea.
Thanks so much, Myles. And I see Jéssica and Alana both have their hands up. Jéssica, why don't you lead us off?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to push back a little bit on the giving up on the utopia. I think if something COVID has shown that it can, like, things can't stop, like one day to the other, like literally one day to the next, it stopped. And in the case of Mexico, which is the case I know more about, they stop, but not the extraction. So it's very like it was very intentional what things can stop and which things are not allowed to stop. And I think it's but I do share that it's not a matter of like changing who is in charge, but people are saying, and as I said, I never got to the alternative part, but people are saying we need to change the system, right? And that's part of now the climate movement. Let's change the system, not change the climate. And I think that's the key. And I do think there's the possibility of dismantling the form, so the supply chain changes, right? So it's not related to just changing the people in charge.
Oops, Alana.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Cool. So I'll just one thing that I found like quite useful to a certain extent is so in Australia, you know, rural communities all over have been fighting against the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. You know, including communities that are reliant on these industries. You know, they're starting to encroach very close to villages and things like that, and people are really pushing back on that. And you know, the climate and energy justice movements have been supporting those communities. But for those communities, the main concern isn't climate. The main concerns are like more localized environmental and social impacts, economic impacts as well. And so one thing I've been doing is I've been looking at, well, you know, here's a campaign that we support because we say that all of these impacts are unacceptable, but you need to take that same energy and look at transitions to renewable. And if those same impacts are happening, you need to be just as angry about that. And you know, a person who I guess is a liberal said to me, well, no, I don't think that's right. We don't have to be as concerned. Why should we be as concerned? And I think that's a really dangerous viewpoint, and one that I've been trying to push back on. And it's, yeah, so great to hear so many other ways that energy justice is kind of being brought up in other spheres. But I think that comparative framework can be quite helpful for some people who do see the justice being more about issues on top of the climate crisis, that there are those more localized or, you know, even global concerns around supply chains and things like that.
That's great, Alana. Thank you. Nikki.
Yeah, thank you for, I'm gonna figure out how to lower my hand. Thank you for all of these comments, and I really appreciate Jéssica's insistence not to give up on utopia. I think that's really important. It's something that sometimes I do give up on. So, but I guess in response to the question around like the exact tactics, I think are like I'm amazed and excited by the proliferation of tactics that different organizers across the South, across the US, across the world are using. And I don't think it's really my place to say like which ones are, I'm not trying to evaluate those as much as like what work can academic scholarship do to support this diversity of tactics. And I think in my own work, thinking about like trying to keep that excitement and energy about how to change systems of extraction is also in part showing how these systems of extraction came to be. And denaturalizing the idea. I think there's a lot of really excellent scholarship in around like electricity and denaturalizing the idea of a natural monopoly, to think about how this was an intentionally created system at a particular point in time, which is one thing that I spoke about. But I think in all of our presentations, there's ways in which we're seeing new systems come into creation, which allows opportunity for critique and to imagine other ways of being. And so just to go back very briefly to the last question, I would affirm everything everyone said before, in that energy justice to me is a very locally rooted practice. And in the sense of its overlaps and solidarities with other local issues and struggles. Energy is just one part of our lived experience, but understanding how it can be, how those issues can come into alliance with other kinds of organizing around labor, around housing, around reproductive rights are super important to consider in that local context. So thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. I loved how you focus like with the intersectional dimension of that right out of the gate in your presentation too. Jéssica, you had your hand up. Did you want to follow up?
Yes, I just wanted to say that like focusing on that specific on one specific struggle, and like very looking at what Myles was saying, like the supply chain, it actually can allow us to build stronger solidarities. Because in the case of this project that I'm talking about, it's built with capital from Mexico and it's Spain, but the companies are based in Spain. So looking at those practices, a lot of activists in Spain have highlighted how it's built on the debt in Spain, and the workers are being laid off during COVID, and again, it's not just like, it's not nationals against each other. It's not Spain concrete in Mexico. Again, it's just the companies extracting. So there are certain companies, and the solidarities can be formed through that. So in Spain, they're talking about debt rights, debt and like insurance and stuff like that from these companies that at the same time attacking the project in Mexico that is also violating human rights. So I think those tactics, like going to different registers, are happening, and they are making the case that this is a very broad situation, right? It's not just about the land, and it's not just about labor, it's about everything, basically.
Thank you, Jéssica. I couldn't agree more. Now we've had a question come in on the Q&A. I know we're at time, but maybe we can give this question an audience. James Goodman says, "What an inspiring panel! How do climate-related energy transitions make injustices/stratifications visible and contestable? How is this process moving or cascading across social fields?" Does anybody have a quick response to that one?
Yes, I'm sorry. I think
No, please do go for it, Jéssica.
No, it's just that I was recently listening to another panel, and they were saying that energy transition, perhaps we should think about not transition, but adding, because the transition does not eliminate the previous regime, but just add new stuff through it. And I think that's one. Just thinking about what it means, like what is we are transitioning from and into, and perhaps thinking how it's more like adding up or building off of other things. It's how it is visible, and then it's contestable, as I was saying before, like looking at very much how is the relationship between, for example, Mexico and Spain can make things visible to people in the ground, and that's a language that's very much in contest.
I think you're right, and it occurs to me also that since energy, at least our modern conceptualization of energy, is so much the foundational infrastructure of so many modern projects, when energy is involved, it does draw things to the surface. I think it makes things visible, including deeper, long-seated structural inequalities, histories of extraction and so forth, in ways that maybe by bringing them more to the surface actually can be addressed in ways that are constructive. I see both Myles and Alana have their. Let's give you both a chance to respond quickly before we wrap up. Myles.
I think Alana had her hand first up.
Oh, Alana.
Okay, yeah, just super quickly, I guess two ways that come to mind. So this idea of energy literacy, which comes through, for some people, individual ways of starting to engage more with their energy, but, more what I would like to see is community-based ways of thinking through energy. I've personally seen some really, quite like fast and incredible leaps from people becoming literate in what our energy systems look like to then becoming more interested in energy justice. So that's one way. Another really quick one is, something that other people have alluded to is this idea of international solidarity campaigns within Australia. We've recently had quite a high profile one where activists within Australia and India have been kind of co-producing a campaign against the Adani Corporation, which has been, having coal mines here in Australia, but also, it's quite an extractive corporation in India. And I could see that those international solidarity, those relationships that have been built could cohere over to thinking about renewables, because probably unsurprisingly, the renewable energy industry in India, some colleagues of mine are doing some work on that at the moment. It's, pretty extractive, doing some very dodgy things. So continuing those solidarity relations, I think, is really important.
Great point, Alana. Myles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the examples people have raised of how energy transitions can create greater visibility around questions of justice and energy are spot on. And I just want to suggest that as I think all of us become sort of illuminated to how ever-present energy is and how energy is enmeshed in questions of justice, I think we're all constantly being educated and finding new areas that we had never even thought of. And I just urge all of us to never be complacent in that search to finding new areas where energy and justice intersect, because one thing I want to point out is energy often is a force of invisibilizing, of obfuscating. And this is sort of why I'm very glad, Jéssica, that you raised the importance of holding on to utopia, and I'm sympathetic to that. And but part of why I'm critical of that too is I see how utopic imaginaries among eco-socialists, among people who want to fight capitalism and neoliberalism, who I'm entirely aligned with in those respects, often, and I've been guilty of this, we've all been guilty of this, I think, often have the sort of unwitting tendency to fetishize technologies. And obviously, eco-socialists, I don't think anyone else on this call, right, believe, well, we just need to get the technology out there and then we're good, right? We obviously recognize there are more just ways to transition than other ways. But even so, even with the eco-socialist imaginary of how do we ensure that the most marginalized people are taking the lead and actually can control our infrastructures, even that sort of utopic vision, I think, overlooks the enmeshment of the material properties that enable those technological traditions in capital, and not only the enmeshment, I would say the irreversible enmeshment. So just to take one teeny example before I shut up, and thanks for listening to me talk so much. Think about silicon, right? Silica is foundational to is not a very deleterious element or form of life to extract, right? It's not like coal mining, and it's essential to the overwhelming majority of solar panels. And yet, the way in which silica is mined and processed are embedded in fully embedded in capitalized supply chains. It doesn't matter, as far as I'm concerned, how much my community gets together and decide we want to do an eco-socialist transition the right way. We can do really incredible things if we commit to that, right? That doesn't mean that that's a failed step that one could take. But even if we do that, we're not going to decapitalize, as far as I'm concerned, silica supply chains, right? Silicon is irrevocably, in my opinion, enmeshed in capital. And I think we need to be aware of that, because it's very easy for us to see energy and because the forms of producing energy often make so many of these processes invisible. And so that again, the point here is, I hope that we continue to not be complacent, continue to learn, continue to recognize that there are so many ways, so many facets of our energy system that we don't see, that we're not aware of, that relate to justice, and that we can always be doing more and learning more to making those connections and making more things visible.
Thank you, Myles. Terrific. And I just footnote that by saying, I think, there's this a bit of life wisdom is always choose. You can't live without utopias, but you have to choose your utopias wisely. In this case, one that's not too burdened and encumbered by technological fantasies is probably the right way to go. All right, folks, we run a little late, but it's because it was a fascinating panel. I want to thank the panelists for, again, terrific conversation. Somebody posted in our chat here that we wish it could go on for another hour, and I think that's probably where we all are. So let's make a commitment here to do that somehow, figure out a way to get back together, perhaps IRL, as they say, down the road. But I want to give the final word to the conference organizer, Joe Campana. Joe, are you there?
I sure am. I've been listening to everything. So listen, it's late on what for many is a holiday weekend. Thank you for staying with us all. I want to thank Dominic for arranging this fantastic panel. I couldn't be happier that the occasion ended with a reflection on energy justice. The number one thing our undergraduates ask for is more thinking, more courses, more action, more environmental justice, right? And so every time I learn more, and I've learned so much from Nikki and Myles and Jéssica and Alana, it makes it easier for me with my colleagues to advocate for more of that. So I really, really appreciate that. I appreciate you all staying with us until the end, not the bitter end, the bittersweet end, because we would love it to go on. And I just want to say thank you to you all. But also, since we'll be talking as a community here at Rice about how Cultures of Energy continues, because it will, I want to also say, see you all soon. Thank you very much and have a wonderful weekend.